London has a GDP of well over $500 billion per year, making it the richest region of Northern Europe. If it were a country, its GDP would be greater than Norway's. But what would the rest of the country look like? Without London, the GDP per capita of the UK would be less than the state of Mississippi, the poorest of the United States. In fact, if you look at all the poorest regions in Northern Europe, the 10th poorest is in the UK, the 9th poorest is in Belgium, and all the others are in the UK. Large parts of the country are not much better off than middle-income developing countries like Poland, but the cost of living is much higher. Of all the countries in the OECD, only Switzerland pays more for childcare. On average, a couple pays 29% of their income on taking care of a child. This is in part because the income of people is not keeping up with rising prices.
Wages have fallen in real terms for over a decade now.
So I'm relying on my parents to get by.
This is the average real wage growth in the OECD until 2015. Greece had the biggest drop, followed by the UK with minus 10%. This is much worse than Italy or France, and it's far behind Eastern Europe. Even today, if you adjust income for inflation, people make around 3% less than they did in 2008. But what is particularly worrisome is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. For every $1 that a person makes in the bottom 90%, a person in the top 1% makes $1.7 million. 1 in 5 adults and 1 in 3 children are now living in poverty, and even in London, poverty is widespread. Their economy might have grown and their wages have tripled since the early 1990s, but their housing prices increased by 7 times. Almost a third of residents in inner London lives in poverty, and the number of homeless people has doubled in the past decade. What happened to the once most prosperous nation in the world? How could it have gone so terribly wrong? This is why the UK is the richest and poorest in Europe. With hindsight. So, part of the disparity lies in generational wealth. The rich they get richer and the poor they stay that way because they have little to pass on. And that is a global problem. Even in the United States, 70% of people live paycheck to paycheck or worse. And they don't have the ability to save and invest their money in the assets that rich people do. But luckily for us, there are some people that are working to even the playing field, giving everybody access to high-value assets. Including one kind of asset that the royal family has over £10 billion of to their name: fine art. I'm talking about today's sponsor, Masterworks art investing platform, who have successfully paid out over $60 million in net proceeds to their investors across 23 successful exits. In fact, with 3 illustrative sales, Masterworks investors have realized net annualized returns of 17.6%, 17.8%, and 21.5%. With Masterworks, you don't need to be an art expert or have a royal net worth either. It's easy to invest right alongside your stocks and bonds. In fact, if you're ready to join the 900,000 plus people that are already checking out Masterworks, you can click the link in the description below to get priority access to Masterworks to see if fine art investing is something for you. Now, back to the video. Income inequality has always been a challenge. Today, the highest 20% of earners take home over a third of all income. The top 1% is responsible for 8% of all income. If we study these figures over time, you can see that the share of the top 20% has not changed that much. But the top 1% has doubled their share of income since the 1970s. In that time, the UK was a different place. There were children who lived in poverty, but it was half of what it is today. There were people sleeping on the streets, but 20 times fewer. But the economy was struggling. The UK used to be the industrial heartland of Europe, with at least 24 world-leading towns and cities. But in the 1950s and 60s, mainland Europe had overtaken the UK, and it held them back that they didn't cooperate as closely with other European nations. When the UK joined the EU in 1973, the only European countries that are part of the OECD with a lower GDP per capita were Portugal, Greece, Ireland, and Spain. The move to enter the EU was widely supported and confirmed in a referendum by 2/3 of the voters. What followed was a reform from an industrial economy with state-controlled industries towards a service economy with private industries. This stopped the economic decline, but it facilitated a much more unequal distribution of wealth. In the late 1970s, the UK was as equal as Denmark and the Netherlands are today, as measured by the Gini index, which stood at 27% in 1977. But if we lay this on a graph, we can see that the UK became significantly less equal during the 1980s and plateaued from the 1990s and onwards, with a peak in 2009. Today, the UK is the most unequal rich country in the world after the United States. That shift to inequality coincided with a shifting culture of governance. The British created a more individualistic society, geared toward personal reward, but it rested on financial systems that allowed a small group of people to hoard much of the country's wealth. Many national assets were privatized. Companies that provide water, electricity and gas, and even the country's infrastructure fell into the hands of a few very wealthy individuals. Today, 90% of all national assets are privatized, making the UK one of the most narrowly owned economies in the developed world. After the early 1990s, the inequality trend became more volatile. It was affected by the financial crisis in the late 2000s and then again by the pandemic in 2020. The impact of Brexit is still widely debated, but in early 2024, a government report stated that the UK had lost 2 million jobs, and the economy had shrunk with £140 billion, or $180 billion. But regionally, it can look different. If we lay the regions of the UK on a chart with 0 being the country's average, and pull up the data of how the wages have been affected, we can tell that richer regions like London and South East did worse than traditionally weaker regions like Northern Ireland. If we look at the employment growth, the results are more diverse. London did relatively well, but so did Northern Ireland, while the richer South East performed poorly. Over the past decades, the British economy has turned into a cash cow for the already rich. The prices of assets are growing over time, making the old wealthier and making wealth less attainable for the young. By 2023, the wealth of the 50 richest families was equal to half the wealth of the entire British population. Last year, the UK saw the biggest rise in poverty in 3 decades. Now, nearly 1 in 5 people and 1 in 3 children live in absolute poverty, and 1 in 7 adults is food insecure, meaning that they don't have access to sufficient food to meet their basic needs. The United Kingdom, once the most prosperous and advanced economy in the world, is now living on the edge. But the economy of London is growing, and the rich are getting much richer. So I've already bombarded you right now with data and visualizations, but if you look at them in the wrong way, they can be very misleading. So take this map that I showed you in the introduction. It shows the richest and the poorest regions in Northern Europe, and I've used this map before in a video about the Netherlands. Because if you look at number 6 here in the Netherlands, that region is actually one of the poorest in the country, but it is listed here as one of the richest. So check out that video, I'll put up a link in there right now if you want to check it out next. But for looking at the United Kingdom, I found that it was very useful. And actually that example that I shared earlier about comparing the rest of the UK to Mississippi, that is something that has been said many times before. And I found that in an article from the Financial Times. And they had another really interesting analysis. If you put the GDPs per capita of the highest performing regions of the UK, Germany, Netherlands and the United States on an axis, you can identify London, Munich, Amsterdam and San Francisco as the highest performers. The nation's averages are these blue lines, and if you take out the highest performers, the nation's averages drop to this red line. You can see that Germany's average is almost unaffected, which means that their economy is highly spread out. But the UK's average drops by 14%, meaning that their economy is highly London-centric. On this map, you can see those differences in a different light. The richest region of Northern Europe lies on the same island as 9 out of the 10 poorest regions. London generates nearly a quarter of the UK's GDP and is one of the world's leading financial centers. Their economy is dominated by service industries, particularly financial and professional services, which employ 85% of residents. They benefit from having English as their native language, and their central time zone allows London to act as a hub between Asia and North America. They are the 7th largest metropolitan economy in the world, after the 6 largest areas, which are all in the United States. The rest of the country does benefit from London's economic success. They keep the country's economy afloat, and they contribute far more to the central government than other regions. But this inequality makes the UK less healthy, less happy, and more unsafe than countries like Germany and France, which were traditionally considered to be its peers. But the GDP per capita of the UK outside of London is similar to that of Italy and Spain, and the bottom 10% weakest regions have a similar performance as Slovenia and Estonia, and they are home to 20% of the population. So after decades of failing to distribute the country's wealth and with poor economic results, a case could be made that it now makes more sense to place the UK in the same league as Southern European countries. Or if Eastern Europe continues to grow as it does, it might even make more sense to compare the UK with Slovenia or Poland.